This is the Content Strategy Insights podcast, episode number 194. Even the smallest organization has several different people and business units communicating with its customers and members. Orchestrating a modern organization's content so that it makes sense to everyone who reads it and that it aligns to the organization's intent is an urgent challenge. Hilary Marsh introduced the idea of content councils to address this issue, to glue back together content disconnected by organizational silos.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 194 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I am really happy today to welcome to the show Hilary Marsh. Hilary has been doing content strategy as long as anybody I know, and has had the title, I think, as long as anyone I know. So she's a true veteran and a real leader and guidepost for the profession. She's currently the president and chief strategist at the Content Company, and she's known for so many things. She runs a community for content strategists. She's done some kind of groundbreaking research about association content strategy with some colleagues. Anyhow, welcome to the show, Hilary. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Sure. So just quickly, my background is in doing content strategy, hiring people to do content strategy, leading teams, teaching content strategy, mentoring people, speaking at conferences, and as you said, fostering communities so that other people have an avenue and a platform to learn from each other and share with each other. Because, conferences are awesome, but then they're done. And so how do we keep those interactions and those conversations going? And an online community is the best way I know how to do it. So there are good communities. I used to run one on LinkedIn, and I kind of abandoned that community because LinkedIn's group management tools just really got terrible. And there's also a really active, wonderful group on Facebook. But I know a lot of people are leaving Facebook, and there's a Slack, but Slack's interface isn't good for everyone. So I started a community on a different platform as well.
Yeah, and I'll link to that in the show notes as well, because that's a really good community, and you do events and I've met so many people the last couple years who either discovered or developed their career because of that. So thanks for your work on that front.
Sure.
But I wanted to talk to you today about another thing you've been up to lately.
Oh, yeah.
You told me a while back about it's either call it a digital council or content council, but I think we're all familiar with the problem of silos and working with a variety of colleagues across an organization and all of it sounds like your council addresses both those and a lot of other issues that content strategists face constantly. So tell me a little bit about the origin of this council idea and what the issues it's designed to address.
Sure. Well, so I need to take a tiny step back. For the most part, my clients that I work with are professional associations. So they're in, a medical profession, a legal profession, an engineering profession. They could be any kind of work, real estate profession. And I worked for 5 years for the National Association of Realtors, which is how I got involved in this industry, if you will, the association industry and the association profession. And so in those, so I work with associations, and I also work with corporate intranets, which are shockingly similar, but we can maybe get to that or talk about it offline. But so in the association world, there are staff people who keep the trains running. There are member volunteers who sometimes sort of influence or dictate what the program should be, or sometimes create the content that is of the problem or of the issue. I like to say that content is the way our work is manifested in the world. Because any program, product, service, anything that an association would offer, or really any organization, manifests itself in the world as words and pictures and audio and video. Even if it's a physical product, at the end of the day, it's still in the world as content. And associations, for the most part, the things that they do, conferences, courses, publications, original research, all those advocacy work, all those kinds of things are content. And so, but everyone creates it individually. Every, member volunteer committee, every staff department creates them alone. So it's literally those silos. And associations, because of the layer of volunteers, the departments do a good job about having back and forth and interactions with the volunteer committees that they are sort of attached to, but they don't remember to do very much or do enough internal communications across departments. They don't plan content together. They don't write it from a common voice and tone guide. They just sort of do their own thing. So, and that's fine. So the picture before the internet existed, every department would create what they created and like mail a newsletter or give it a brochure to an audience, and they didn't have to worry about what everybody else was doing, even if they could have or should have back then. The deficit for not doing that, or the drawback for not doing that, wasn't as clear. And then the internet came along, and at this point it came along a long time ago, but it hasn't transformed always how departments work together or don't work together. And because of that, the differences are much clearer and more evident to the audience, because it all lives next to each other on the homepage. It all might be included in one newsletter or multiple separate newsletters that never mention each other. I had one client who said, subscribe to our newsletters, and it was only the ones that their department created. So everybody sees themselves as separate, with these blinders on, and it's not that it's not good, it's just not connected. So how do we connect the content? And there's I say that there's three kinds of glue. One is taxonomy. So if you're producing content on the same topic, it could be tagged, even if nobody knew that Department A knew that Department B was also producing content on the same topic. If it was at least connected and related content, if you're interested in this, here's more on this topic, or more for this audience, or more for this purpose, taxonomy can be your friend there. And getting everybody to agree on the same terms for the taxonomy, that's a whole separate effort, usually one that I'm involved with on a pretty superficial level, and I entrust that to folks with much more specialized expertise than I've got. The second one is internal communications, like a content calendar, and that kind of thing. And the third one is creating groups of people who come together to make decisions about policies, what content should be public, what should be password protected, where do we have too much content, where do we have a gap. When we're creating content for different audiences, which audiences are the most important? So that's not for me as the consultant to say. And it's not for me for the particular client who hired me to make that determination. It's got to be a cross-departmental team that makes decisions like that. And so they've got to be people who are close enough to the content to be aware of the pain points and the process and how things work, but also who have enough organizational perspective to be willing and able to work with their peers and colleagues to make organization-wide decisions. So I liken content strategy to an orchestra. So in an orchestra, if you have, violins and brass instruments and reeds, et cetera, if each of the musicians, is talented, expert, has gone through years of training, and they're all amazing. But if everybody played their own song at the same time, it would be noise and cacophony to the audience. In the same vein, if every section did its own thing, at the same time, then it would still be noise to the audience. And that, in fact, is the reality far too often. So content strategy is like an orchestra conductor, but I don't think that it's for one person or one group to decide for everyone. It's that one group to facilitate the conversations inside so that you start to help each people from each department see the holisticness of what they do and what they should do.
Interesting. So this sounds like where the council comes in. That's
Yeah.
you mentioned like the need for orchestration, these three kinds of glue that can stitch it together. But from what you just said, it doesn't sound like and no organization yet has its chief content officer. We're all still waiting for that. So in the meantime, it sounds like your council might be the kind of mechanism that can do some of that orchestration. Was that the intent?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's sort of they need to be at the right organizational level in terms of like hierarchy. If they're too low, if they're a content creator, and we involve content creators in a group as well, because they need to not only be informed, but they need to buy in and they need to weigh in, because if we get it wrong because we're not close enough to their daily lives, then it's hard for them, to follow something that's not practical. And then we have the executives who have to sort of buy in and bless policies, especially if it's going to result in any kind of organizational change. But the people doing the work need to be in sort of a middle/high levels, a director, a VP kind of level, depending on the complexity and size of the organization. Because those people are familiar enough with what their teams are doing and also have the ear of the folks above them. And if as a group, a cross-functional team, if they agree and say, this is what we think we should do in terms of operationalizing things, the management team, the executive team is not going to say no, because all the folks who need to buy in have said, yes, this is what we collectively decided. So there's a lot of value to a council, and there's sort of different phases. There's the set the policies and make decisions together phase. And then there's the evaluate high level requests and vet requests based on strategic goals. Because if somebody comes in with a new initiative or new functionality or a whole new section that they want to shift the website or add this to the plate of the collective organization, who's going to decide which projects then have to take a step back or get delayed because this new thing now is important?
Yeah, as you're talking about that, you're reminding me. Well, first of all, you're reminding me of governance there. That's like
it's all governance, right?
Yeah, it's all governance all the time, because
Yeah.
like who decides is such a crucial
Yes.
crucial thing about it. But also, I love that
But
layer.
the answer is sort of like we decide. So how do we get to that place of we decide? That's what it is.
Interesting. Well, how do you, because we is a big word in organizational culture. There's so much to get, just politics and power and all the things that we all wrestle with all day.
Yeah.
How, I guess, let me back to your council idea, your council concept. Is this a mechanism by which you can do, like, I don't know, power sharing and more collaborative kind of engagement of those kind of key stakeholders that make this happen?
Yeah, so what I typically do is establish kind of frameworks. So here's an example. When we decide who are our most important audiences, right? It's a tricky thing, because Department X will say one thing, Department Y will say something else. But organizationally, we have to prioritize our audiences. And it's my job as the consultant to help them create a framework for them to do it. Is it the biggest audience? Is it the one that brings us the most money? Is it the most loyal one? It can't be everyone. So what are the factors that we want to use to consider that question of audience prioritization? And then once we've prioritized the audience, then we can look at the content, for example, and say, do we have enough for these people? Do we have too much? is the content we're creating for this audience being used as much as the content for the other audience? And we can ask much more intelligent questions, and a council might be asking the questions. They're not going to be the ones doing the daily work. It would be the content strategy team doing the daily work, but they're really an important vetting body that has to then agree and then go carry that message back to their department. Hey, put the brakes on this one. We're going to wait on this initiative, because they've got the internal authority in their own department to be able to do that.
Yeah, as you say that, so I'm getting the way that mechanism works now is that because it's framed or positioned as a framework, that's sort of like, I don't know, take some of the political peril out of it. It seems like maybe, and the fact that it's a collaborative decision and so the makeup of these councils. Do you have to have like equal representation across the org for it to really work?
Well, usually there's one person from every major content creating department. So you don't necessarily need legal if legal's not doing it. Sometimes IT is involved, for example, and sometimes they're not. It depends on the organization. You don't need facilities because they don't create content. So it's external facing departments who are creating content.
Got it. So anybody who needs content to communicate with their stakeholders. And that was interesting too. You mentioned earlier in kind of the setup that like a lot of these, it sounds like a lot of them are better at communicating with and coordinating with the volunteers around their purview or traditionally maybe that they have been better at that than in communicating with each other.
Yes, and that's really tricky because a member volunteer is sort of like the U.S. House of Representatives or the collective set of member volunteers. So if your next door neighbor got elected to the House of Representatives, they're not just a person on the block anymore. They know the internal lingo, they understand how things work, they understand the pushes and pulls and those internal government kind of dynamics that I don't understand, because I'm not in the House of Representatives. And it might be, US or state or city, doesn't matter, but, you get the idea. So if they're sort of separate, the danger is that if the department uses the committee as the focus group, that's not the same as the typical average everyday member. They're different. And so they are, associations like to say that they're member driven. And typically what they mean is that they're driven by the member volunteers. That is the dynamic. The other analogy I draw is teachers. So my son's third grade teacher reminded me that he's always a third grade teacher, but my son was only in third grade one time. So it's a similar kind of dynamic there too. So where do you as the parent override what the teacher wants, and the teacher knows what third graders need, but they don't know your kid? And so there's lots of similar kinds of dynamics at play.
And you multiply that across any org because each person has their one lens on it. Well, I guess it sounds like this is a way to bring not multiple focuses, but like getting people to drop their magnifying glass and talk to each other for a little bit.
Yeah. There's a reason that an organization, and this is true also for other organizations outside the association world, but the associations have that member volunteer lens, layer, which is just different and special. But it's similar kinds of things are true for plenty of other organizations too. Who are they beholden to? Who are their stakeholders? And on all those kinds of things.
Yeah. I want to back up at the start. When we first started talking about this, you talked about the kinds of glue, and it seems like most of what we've been talking about is the sort of the group dynamics and the group interactions. But some of the more like sort of I don't know, implementation things like taxonomy, like crafting a taxonomy and agreeing on terminology. That's a classic, challenge, in this kind of thing. What's the role of the council in that kind of activity, in a thing like taxonomy or terminology alignment?
They may not. It might be members. in a lot of cases, members. So I just finished working with an association that was a medical specialty, and it was the doctors who had to agree on the terms. The staff are good at producing conferences and doing the work of the organization, facilitating the creation of new clinical guidelines and producing publications, and they may be doctors, but they may not be doctors, because they're people who are professionals in the executing the work. So those kinds of cases, usually you have to involve the member. You
That's
have to
right.
involve the subject matter experts. But the problem is that the magazine's got a taxonomy, the education people have a taxonomy, the website has a taxonomy, et cetera, and I've seen a dozen. So you have to bring them together and facilitate the conversations about that.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I was getting at. And I think, and actually it occurs to me, we should have put a legend at the top of this, that like when you talk about members, those are your subject matter experts that's in this world. And I think
Yes.
most content people are familiar with that notion of capturing and articulating subject matter expertise in a way that's better articulated than some subject matter experts are capable of. I think that's our whole job, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And you have the facets. For example, I find that a lot of associations will focus on the topic facet, but they leave behind the audience facet, which is so super important, maybe geographic, maybe activity, maybe other things besides just the topic alone, because all of those filters will let you do something like personalize the content.
That's it. And that's like our subject matter expertise is accounting for all that stuff in
Right.
because we were talking, I can't remember if we talked about this before I hit record, but anyhow, that notion that your content is just it is the expression of your business and what you're
No, we
doing.
said that. I said that at the beginning. The
Yeah.
content is the way your work is manifested in the world. And I said that I created that little mantra meme phrase because when I would say, well, content strategy, people producing events said, well, you're not talking to me. People producing advocacy work, well, that's not content. So many of the people producing content didn't understand that I mean them.
Mhm. Yeah,
And so I had to figure out how to make it clear that we're not talking about something that the communications or media or public affairs people do over there. It's all of our work, because this is how it manifests online or in the world.
that reminds me of the second kind of glue you mentioned is the internal communications that
Yeah.
that this council facilitates that kind of thing. You mentioned because I think you said something about like an editorial calendar. That's a classic one. What other kinds of techniques or artifacts are there that facilitate that? Like the expression of the taxonomy, or just tell me a little bit more about how the internal communication, how the council facilitates that.
Well, I think there's a whole bunch of different things. To a large degree, it's about trust. So each of them needs to figure out how to communicate the collective decisions to their own people. And then when a particular set of work is done, they need to go shop it up, shop it to the people above them, get their blessing, and then it becomes the organizational policy that you communicate it however you do that. And then sometimes there are opportunities to get involved directly in communicating things to the organization itself. So when I worked for the National Association of Realtors, we went through a big effort of creating these empathy-based personas and what I now have come to call audience engagement journeys. And I created a life-size cutout of each of them, wrote a tiny script, and had them like introduce themselves. I had a staff person read each one, introducing the personas to the staff at an all-staff meeting. And that was really effective, because then the idea that the persona is your audience standing in front of you is made concrete.
I love that. I got to say, I don't know if you've listened to it, but a couple of episodes back, I had Rafaela Ellensberg. She's a content engineer at a big grocery store chain here in the Netherlands, and she said they have a room there that's just like all about their customers. And I'm picturing like your personas is now standing in that room alongside of all that kind of artifact. That's really interesting. It also reminds me of like, are people learning how to better communicate in general across departments and silos and kind of with, and up and down and across the organization because of this council mechanism? Like, or is it kind of a forcing function to get people to think more broadly about communication?
But it's not only the council alone. So a few years ago, I did a study with Carrie Hain and Dina Lewis on content strategy adoption and maturity in associations. And the challenge we had was coming up with a survey so we could ask associations, are you doing this work? So that we could sort of understand what their maturity level is. But one of the things that we three identified is that if somebody is responsible for creating content or managing content or facilitating member created content, for example, it has to, their job description might have to change, because accountability for content use, accountability for collaboration, accountability for content success, setting goals and determining who the audience is, and then understanding, did it work? That has to be part of people's job descriptions. So the council's part of it, but it's certainly not the whole thing.
Interesting. So it's sort of, that's another way to get it ensconced in the culture. Well, that kind
The
of gets
culture,
also,
it's a lot, that word culture, I cannot stress enough.
exactly. And it's like you always need like mechanisms to affect it because
Right.
it's a big one. And so that's really interesting that like content strategy as an HR practice almost.
I always say content strategy is an HR issue, and I always get a quizzical look because people don't realize that thing. But if you're going to want people to collaborate, then their boss has to measure them at least in part on, did you collaborate? Otherwise, they're plenty busy with other stuff. And if it's not something they're going to be held accountable for, it's going to fall by the wayside.
Yeah, that's really, yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
It's whether they want to or not. It's not a question of want to. It's a question of delivering what they're supposed to deliver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and working in a way they're supposed to work.
Exactly, the very definition of a job description.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Hilary, I can't believe it. I warned you ahead of time. These always go way too fast.
Oh, yeah.
But we're coming up close to time. But before we wrap up, is there anything you want to revisit from the conversation, or just want to make sure we share before we wrap up?
Well, I have to say that study, people have told me, is really useful, even if you're not in the association profession. It costs $10 if you're not a member of the organization that funded it. But so it's a very inexpensive thing. And even though it's a few years old, it's super helpful. And in addition to the study, in order to help people place themselves on this kind of maturity scale, and it's totally simple, beginner, intermediate, advanced, we have a little assessment tool, and I wrote an article kind of outlining steps about how to make progress once you determine where your organization's biggest pain points are. So there's that.
Yeah, I'll link to that. I dropped the $10 like 4 or 5 years ago, whenever it came out, and it was totally worth it. Yeah, and I totally agree. And I'm really curious. I'm going to revisit it now because it's been a while. I want to go see what nuggets I might have missed.
And the Digital Council, let me just say one more thing. The Digital Council might not be something that even makes sense if your organization is just starting on your content strategy journey. And it will depend on the volume, the size of your organization, the nature of what it is you're talking about and what you're producing. So it doesn't make sense for everyone all the time, but especially in an intermediate or advanced organization that's producing lots of different kinds of content from lots of different sources, developing a body like that. So I gave I actually co-led a workshop about this just recently. And in preparation for that, we interviewed 6 different people to find out what that meant or what that looked like at their organization. So somebody called it a community of practice, so it could be called different things and cast a little bit differently in different organizations, but it's still the same kind of concept.
Yeah, and I love the way you just tied together that the notion of maturity and the idea of the council that you need to understand your maturity as an organization before you do anything.
Content strategy maturity, right?
Yeah, your content strategy maturity. Yeah. Thanks. Oh, hey, one very last thing, Hilary. If folks want to connect and learn more about the council or just connect with you online, what's the best way to find you?
My email address is Hilary with one L at contentcompany.biz. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm still hanging out on Twitter a little bit. And I have this community at content-strategy.com. So you can certainly find me there as well.
Yeah.
And it's free to join.
Yep. And I will, again, reiterate my enthusiasm for that community. And I'll put all that in the show notes as well. Well, thank you so much, Hilary. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.